Hello and welcome to Cloud and Proud Azure Technical Series with me, Daniel Baker. Cloud and Proud is a series of workshop sessions designed to help you understand Azure and prepare you for certification success through a series of business case studies that focus on using key aspects of the Microsoft Cloud. We will work together and together we will build business solutions using a variety of tools. If you have any questions or feedback during the sessions, then please feel free to reach out to me because I'm always happy to hear from you. So let's set the context of this session. Contoso is a small born-in-the-cloud manufacturing company that wishes to migrate its existing Azure deployments from an Azure Service Management model to Azure Resource Manager. While ASM continues to be supported, the company realizes the immediate benefits of migrating to ARM. This includes benefits such as template-based deployment, role-based access control, and resource tagging. In this exercise, we will investigate the various tools available and migrate resources between the models. There are various benefits for migrating across to the new management model. These include the ability to deploy, manage, and monitor all resources for a solution as a group, the ability to repeatedly deploy consistent solutions throughout the development lifecycle. We also have the ability to manage our infrastructure through declarative templates rather than scripts. What's more, we also have the ability to define dependencies between resources and ensure that they are deployed in the correct order. Further to that, we have the ability to integrate role-based access control into our deployments, as well as the ability to apply tags to resources to help facilitate resource and cost control. A great benefit of Resource Manager is that it provides a consistent management layer for tasks that you perform through Azure PowerShell, Azure CLI, the Azure Portal, REST APIs, and development tools. All use a common set of operations, allowing you to use the tool that works best for you, interchangeably and without confusion. All resources will belong to a resource group which stores metadata about those resources. There are some important factors to consider when these are defined. Firstly, all the resources in your group should share the same life cycle, and a resource can only exist in one resource group. Next, you can add or remove resources to a resource group at any time and move resources between resource groups if needed. Next, a resource group can contain resources that reside in different regions and interact with resources in other resource groups. And finally, a resource group can be used to scope access control for administrative actions. Before we begin discussing the migration strategy, it's important to understand the difference between the data plane and management plane operations on our IaaS resources. The management plane describes the calls that come into use for modifying resources. This includes operations such as creating, stopping, or restarting a virtual machine. It could include updating a virtual network with a new subnet or even managing running resources. Data plane applications describe the runtime of the application itself and involves interactions with instances that won't go through the Azure API. This could be pulling data from an SQL instance or copying a blob storage account, for example. So let's begin exploring the migration process. There are a number of tools that can achieve your migration goals, and we will investigate some later in this session. But before we start any migrations, we need to consider the following. Firstly, we need to ensure that the resources that we want to migrate use supported features. This will usually be detected by the platform, and we will highlight this during our demonstration. Secondly, virtual machines that are not in a virtual network will be stopped and deallocated as part of the prepare operation. This is because all ARM-based VMs must be present on a VNet for security purposes. As always, we should plan our migration during non-business hours and ensure that we download the current configuration of our virtual machines for validation after the prepare step is complete. Finally, we should update our automation scripts to handle the Resource Manager deployment model and evaluate the role-based access control policies that are configured on our classic IaaS resource deployments. There are three migration scopes that primarily target compute, network, and storage. Firstly, we have the migration of virtual machines that are not in a virtual network. Now, in the ASM model, VMs didn't require a VNet because they became part of a cloud service and as such had shared access to a VIP address with differentiation of ports to enable connectivity. In the Resource Manager deployment model, security is enforced for your applications. This means that all VMs need to be in a virtual network which can either be created during migration or joined into an existing deployment. For virtual machines already in a virtual network, the migration process is simplified and no downtime is required. Now, this is because only the metadata is migrating between the classic and Resource Manager deployment models. The fact is, the underlying VMs are running on the same hardware in the same network and with the same storage. Management plane operations may not be allowed during the migration, but data plane will continue to function. Finally, with storage account migrations, you can choose to migrate across to the new model once virtual machines and VNets have successfully moved. Let's now take a look at the migration workflow. The validation operation is the first step in the migration process. Now, the goal of this step is to analyze data in the background for the resources under migration and return the success or failure flag, indicating if the resources are capable of migration. Once validated, you begin the prepare phase. This simulates the transformation of the IaaS resources from Classic to ARM. Next, you can use the configuration that you downloaded earlier to validate that the migration looks correct. Alternatively, you can sign into the portal and spot check the properties and resources to validate that the metadata migration looks good. If you are migrating a virtual network, most configuration of the virtual machines is not restarted. For applications on those virtual machines, you can validate that the applications are indeed still up and running. Finally, you have the ability to commit the changes or abort the migration, which will revert all changes to the system. So let's take a look at this in practice. Okay, so let's jump into our system, and I've opened up a couple of portals. Now I've opened up the new portal and created a couple of dashboards. And I've also opened up the classic portal. Now you'll see that there's some directories in there from existing projects, but that's it. Under all items, nothing else is in there. So we're going to go ahead and start building our demo environment. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to come down into networks, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new virtual network. So I'm going to call this ASM-VNet. I want to make sure that it's in, I'm going to say Central US, and I want to choose Visual Studio Enterprise with MSDN. Let's just change that back down to Central US. I'm going to go ahead and say next. Now, just going back there, you may notice that you have different options depending on what one you choose. That's only down to subscription. So if you haven't got one that's exactly the same and you want to follow along, just go ahead and pick a different location. But ASM-VNet, Central US, and I'm choosing my Visual Studio Enterprise with MSDN. So as we move to the next screen, it wants to know, do I want to pick a DNS server? Do I want to configure a point-to-site or a site-to-site connection? For the sake of our demo, I don't. I just want to come across to our virtual network address space. So I'm going to go ahead and put in an address space of 192.168.10.0. And I want to give that a CIDR slash of /24, and then create a new subnet called production. And we'll put that on the /25 bit mask. From there, I'm going to go ahead and say OK, and we'll allow that to create. So that's now created, and what we're going to do is we're going to click on virtual machines, and we're going to go ahead and create a new virtual machine. So I've got two options here. I can do a quick create. I'm going to choose from gallery because it's going to give me slightly more options. So I'm going to choose from gallery. From here, I'm going to choose a Windows Server 2012 R2 data center. Now I need to give it a name. So I'm going to give this ASM-VM MIG1. Okay, so virtual machine migration 1. I'm going to choose the basic tier, and I'll just give that an A2. Now, need to authenticate, so I'm going to put in a username of student, and I'm going to choose a password. And from there, we'll go ahead and say next. Now, at this point, we need to put this into a cloud service. And if you cast your minds back to earlier on in the session, we said that All virtual machines that were created in the classic portal went into a cloud service to share that virtual IP or that VIP address, the public IP address, so they could connect into from across the internet. Every virtual machine would end up with an endpoint, which would be a port that maps from private to public. So we'll go ahead and choose our cloud service. I'm going to choose my Visual Studio Enterprise with MSDN subscription. And at this point, it wants us to choose either the region or the virtual network. And what we should see is that we've got our ASM VNet virtual network that we've just created. At that point, it's picked up our production subnet and is inviting us to go ahead and create a new storage account. Now, you'll notice there's no options in there for us to specify names or anything. So I'm going to go ahead and use an automatically generated storage account, and I'm going to choose not to put this into an availability set. So at that point, I'm going to go ahead and say next. I'm going to choose to install the VM agent, but no other extensions at this time. So from there, I'm going to hit create, and that's going to take about 5 minutes or so. So we'll pause the video and we'll come back when that's done. Okay, and we're back, and we can see that that virtual machine has been created. I also now have a storage account that's been created in there too. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab this storage account name because we're going to use this as part of the migration. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And then what I want to do is I just want to jump over into the new portal, because what we should now see is if I go ahead and hold down G and press R, it's going to open up my resource groups. Now what you'll see is it's created a number of resource groups. So I should have this resource group here, which is showing me the virtual machine and the cloud service, but I then have another resource group which is being used for ASM VNet. I've got another resource group which is being created for storage. So at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to start the migration process. Now, before I do that, what I'm going to do is I'm under my portal, under Contoso ASM, I just want to go ahead and embed some of those options. So if I go into the resource group, I'm going to go ahead and pin the cloud service. I'm going to pin the virtual machine. I'm going to pin the network. And I'm going to go ahead and pin that storage account onto my dashboard. So we can see that we've got these resources that have now been created, and they're visible in both the new and the old portal. Okay, with that done, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump down into a PowerShell script. Now, I'm going to make this PowerShell script available on the Cloud and Proud website. There'll be a link there for you to download, and then you'll be able to follow along with me. So a couple of things that we're going to do. So you can see the first thing that we want to do is select our Azure Resource Manager subscription. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to add an Azure Resource Manager account. So to do this, I'm going to run that selection. It's going to invite me to log in. So we just wait for the authentication to take place. I'll type in my password and sign in. So I've now signed in. What I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm selecting the right subscription. Now, my profile has multiple subscriptions, so you may not need to do this if you're following along, but I'm just going to go ahead and run this so it sets it to my Visual Studio Enterprise. Now, at this point, what we need to do is we need to register for a new resource provider. So I'm going to register the Microsoft Classic Infrastructure Migrate resource provider into my management system. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. Now, typically, if I just run this together, I would have then put a 5-minute wait in. So what we'll do is we're going to discuss the rest of the script, and then we'll come back and we'll continue. So you'd normally wait for 5 minutes. At that point, we're going to switch an Azure account into the Classic portal. We're going to again select our subscription name, and at that point we're going to set our variable for our virtual network, and we can then begin validating preparing and then committing for our virtual machine migration. So you need to bear in mind that if I migrate the virtual network, the VMs that are part of that virtual network will migrate too. Once we've done that, we can then go ahead and set our storage account name variable, and that's why I copied that string. So let's go ahead and paste that in. Let me just put the encapsulation round there. So you can see that we've set our storage account name, and at that point it will prepare and then commit. So again, I'm going to pause the video for 5 minutes, and then when we come back, we'll continue with the rest of the script. Okay, and we're back. So what we're now going to do is we are going to switch into our classic authentication. So you'll notice the difference. It's gone from add Azure RM account into add Azure account. So I'm going to go ahead and run that selection. Again, I need to authenticate. And we'll go ahead and sign in. Okay, so we can see we've signed in. So again, just going to change focus, making sure that we're on the right subscription. And at that point, what I want to do is I want to start setting a variable. So I want to set a variable for my virtual network, which, if you cast your mind back, was ASM-VNet. So let's go ahead and set that variable. Now at this point, if I just move this up a little, we get into our migration tools. So you can see that we've got 4 stages. We can validate, we can prepare, and then we either have the ability to abort or commit. So I'm going to go ahead, and the first thing that I want to do is I want to validate. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And that will take a moment. Now you can see validation failed, and I was expecting that to happen. So the reason that's happened is because there's an extension on the virtual machine that won't migrate across, but we can see this. If I go back into my script, if we put a debug in this, and we run that command again, and I'll just go through and yes these, then what we'll be able to see is we should see that it doesn't like one of the environments. So there we go. So look, ASM VM IG1 in hosted service contains an extension BG-info which is not supported in the Azure Resource Manager. It's recommended to uninstall this. So that's the only error that we got. So I'm going to go ahead and continue. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to go ahead and prepare the environment, and you can see it's very similar all the way through, the same strings, just these bits change. So I'm going to go ahead and prepare, and that's going to take a moment or two. And we can see that that's now succeeded, no problems there at all. So what we'll do is we're now going to check the configuration for the prepared virtual machines, and we're going to choose to commit. So I'm going to go ahead and run that selection. And again, that's going to take a few moments. So what we'll do this time is we're going to pause the video, and we'll come back in a few minutes and we'll see the effect of this script. And we're back. And we can see that that's succeeded. So now let's minimize this script and see what the effects are. So at this point, what I want to do is I just want to go ahead and refresh this screen so we can see what's left. And while that's refreshing, what we'll do is we're going to now jump back into our new portal. I'm going to switch to the ARM dashboard, and I want to go into my resource groups, and you can now see that I've got some new resource groups in there. I've got the ASM VM migration 1 migrated and the VNet migrated. Now if I click on here, what we'll see is we've got the virtual machine, we've got the key vault in there, we've got load balancers, we've got network interfaces, we've got the public IP address. No mention of the cloud service. The cloud service is now effectively gone. If I click on migrated, you can see that I've got that ASM VNet. But interestingly enough, if I now click on default networking, there's nothing in there. If I click on default storage, we still have that storage account in there, but we're going to go ahead and move that in a second. Okay, but the cloud service and everything has now gone. So let's go back into our classic portal and we can see that too. It's no longer visible in the classic portal because the ASM model can't see the ARM deployments. So again, let's jump now back into our script and we're going to do the last couple of steps. We're going to set the variable for our storage account. We're then going to prepare the environment using that variable. And that'll take a moment or two. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and commit those changes. So pause the video, back into a minute or two, and we'll continue. So we can see that our storage prepare stage has succeeded. So the final stage in our script is to go ahead and commit those changes. So I'm going to go ahead and run that selection. We can do the same by pressing F8. And while that's running, what that's going to do is it's going to take it out of ASM. It's going to move it across to ARM. So what we'll see is if I just go in and do a refresh, we can now see that we've got that storage account that has been migrated across to. Okay, and at that point, it will fall out of scope of this management pane. So in a minute, that will no longer be there. We'll come back and check that. The other thing that we need to bear in mind is if I now go back into the ASM, look, assets not found, assets not found, assets not found. So these are no longer present in the classic portal. So again, let's go back into ARM. From here, I can now start adding those resources directly in to my new dashboard. And we can see that we've got new management scope for that. Okay, so back into our script, we can see that that's succeeded. Our script has worked. Back into here, one last refresh, and we should see that that storage account is no longer visible in the classic portal. Okay, so we just wait for this to load. And what we should see is our directories pop up in a second, which they have, but there's no other resources in there. That is now fully managed in the new portal. It's in a new resource group and no longer visible to any other management planes. So before we wrap this session up, it's important to note that there are other options that can be investigated to help your ASM to ARM migrations. Now, some of these are supported by us, others from our developer community. If you head over to the Git repositories, you should be able to find these resources listed and the instructions on how to deploy. I thank you for your time and look forward to seeing you on my next Cloud and Proud session.